Should we start? Right?
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yes.
So,
Go ahead.
with your permission, shall we begin, Professor Arvind?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, sir. So I welcome you all in the second installment of Partition lecture series. Before we start, I would like to briefly talk about the background to this series. The online Partition lecture series was launched in August 2020 at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, IIT Khadagpur. The department has encouraged scholarly research on partition for the past decade under the tutelage and supervision of Dr. Anjali.
আচ্ছা ওই আয়ন ট্যালবট একটা লেকচার দিচ্ছে পার্টিশনের উপর হ্যাঁ এখন শুরু হয়েছে তুমি শুনতে চাও
Sumodato Mandal, yes, ma'am, your mic is on.
I am muting it.
Okay. Okay, right. So the department has encouraged scholarly research on partition for the past decade under the tutelage and supervision of Dr. Anjali Gira Roy. In this regard, an international interdisciplinary seminar titled India at 70 Memories and Histories was organized, which engendered an exhaustive and evocative discussion on Indian partition and its role in the contemporary construction of identities, subjectivities, ethnic violence, and nationalism in India and amongst the Indian diaspora. Furthermore, an ongoing ICSSR-sponsored project after partition, Post Memories of the Afterlife of Partition 1947, documents and archives the oral testimonials of the partition survivors across India. To widen the perspective from which partition has been and needs to be understood, as well as to comprehend its contemporary relevance, Dr. Gira Roy came up with the idea of an online lecture series. The aim is to generate critical dialogue on the tragic legacy of partition. In the first installment, we were honored to host eminent scholars like Dr. Ishtiaq Ahmed, Dr. Harvinder Singh Patti, Dr. Nalini Ayer, Dr. Hina Nandrojak, Dr. Bodh Prakash, Dr. Somdatta Mandal, Dr. Devjani Sen Gupta, Dr. Vinder S. Kalra, Ms. Saz Agarwal, and many others, all of whom ruminated on the ramification of partition in Punjab, Bengal, Sindh, Northeast, and South India. For the second installment of the Partition lecture series, the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, IIT Khadagpur, is honored to collaborate with the Center for Diaspora Studies, Punjabi University. This collaboration, we all hope, would pave the way to an intellectually stimulating discussion on the Indian partition of 1947. Through this series, we aim to make sense of the senseless losses endured by the survivors of the displacement. Thank you. So now I request Professor Arvind to give his introductory remarks. Professor Arvind.
Yeah, I think you have already introduced the series, and I'm very happy that these activities are moving forward. And specifically, you see the way the colonial rule ended, and it ended as if we got freedom, but for a state like Punjab and Bengal, it was a partition and not so much of independence and freedom. Particularly if you look at the older generation, they always called it partition. They never called it freedom or independence. So, as I always say that nation states and things like that exist and all are short. Languages, cultures, academic institutions, universities live current political or current next
I think there is some problem with the connectivity.
Yeah, I lost it.
Right, sir.
So technically happened, that period is extremely important. documenting memories and seeing exactly what happened in time. One can have several narratives, one all done by British, or you can have British narrative that these people could never live in peace. So finally, some kind of reconciliation has to and for the next generation, I mean, the ramifications of such events go much beyond a single generation, and it has impacts on literature, culture, and the entire way of thinking of this region. Well, and fortunately in Bengal, there was one positive. Both sides adopted Bengali, their language, and developed it in the right way. Whereas in the other side of Punjab, other side of the Pakistan, Punjabi was never really on the language. And there are a lot of attachment to the language and people around the initiatives are very important. A long way in our country or South Asia understanding itself. So thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Arvind. Now I request Professor Anjali Gira Roy to introduce Professor Ian Talbot. Professor Gira Roy.
Thank you, Dr. Dhananji. It's my honor and pleasure to introduce Professor Ian Talbot for a number of reasons, because I would like to provide a broader picture of his work on Punjab before zeroing in on partition. Apart from his work on partition, I think my understanding of his work on colonial Punjab, his essays and books on colonial Punjab are provide a very comprehensive and incisive analysis of the issues in colonial Punjab. I would like to relate it to his work on partition, because even though he doesn't directly connect it to his work on Punjab in general, many of the policies and many of the acts and many of the movements that he talks about in his works on Punjab in general, they kind of dovetail into his work on partition, or one can say that they are the aftermath of what was done in Punjab. Now, as a leading scholar in Punjab studies and who has made seminal contributions to the study of Punjab, and also as a partition scholar, scholars in the area of partition studies do not need an introduction to Dr. Talbot, but those who don't, I would like to begin with his affiliation. He is a professor of modern South Asian history and director of the Center for Imperial and Post-Colonial Studies at the University of Southampton, where he was also formerly head of history and director of the Humanities Graduate School. Now, he has published extensively on the 1947 partition of India in books like Divided Cities, Partition and its Aftermath in Lahore and Amritsar, 1947 to 57, Epicenter of Violence, Partition Voices and Memories from Amritsar with Darshan Singh Tatla, who we all know, and the Partition of India with Gurhar Pal Singh. What I found different or unique in his studies of partition is it actually deserves the idea of how all of South Asia was, at least both the Punjabs were affected by partition. So whenever he's presenting the case studies or providing his analysis, he's taking both sides into consideration. a luxury or a privilege which scholars who work on either side of the border are not able to get into because of inability to travel, across the border due to various kinds of regulation. So for a partition scholar, there's nothing more rewarding and more enriching to know what was happening on the other side, because both histories from both sides try to emphasize their side of the story, marginalizing that of the other side. So in the work of Professor Ian Talbot and also the work of Professor Ishtiaq Ahmed, we have stories from both sides. So it's like Lahore and Amritsar are twin cities, and the narratives of the refugees and the settlers and the migrants that he documents in these books and essays, they seem to be mirroring their experience. It's like what was in Lahore is happening in Amritsar. Similarly, the violence which was encountered by Hindus and Sikhs in India was no less than or no more than what was faced by Hindus and Muslims in the present day Pakistan was no less than what the Muslims suffered in India. So this complete picture of Punjab as a region and how partition affected us, we have to turn to the works of Professor Ian Talbot to get a complete picture of how Punjab presented itself on the eve of partition and how Punjabi refugees on both sides of the border resettled themselves. So today he promises to talk about, I think he's going to bring in Bengal also. We all look forward to it. And he's working on the environmental impact and legacy of partition on the city of Lahore. So we don't need, without any further ado, I would request Professor Talbot to begin his lecture, which is titled Rediscovering Partition from New Perspectives. So I think as the inaugural lecture in the second installment of Partition Lecture Series, this is going to provide a kind of direction to the rest of the lectures that follow as to what direction partition studies are going to take. Professor Talbot.
Thank you very much, Anjali, for that introduction. And thank you very much for inviting me as well to be able to share some thoughts with you today. As you were saying in your introduction to me, I've always worked on both sides of Punjab. And I've also started off my research career back in the 1970s, looking at colonial Punjab and particularly at the Unionist Party. And I wrote a biography subsequently on Kizza Tawana, who was the last Prime Minister of the United Punjab before the partition. So in a sense, I'm going to use this lecture to bring together some of my past thoughts and work, and also to think about the ways in which partition studies may be going forward as we move towards now the 75th upcoming anniversary of the division of the subcontinent. And I think one of the things which has been very clear in the last 20 or 30 years, as that each major anniversary has often stimulated a new development in research and writing about the circumstances in which the British left, about the reasons for partition, and of course, in more recent decades, the so-called human dimension, or the history from below of partition. And that's brought out all kinds of interesting work on the gender dimension of violence. It's brought out oral traditions, the hidden histories of partition, including not just the violent side of it, but also the ways in which even at this most polarized period of time in Punjab's history, people assisted members of other communities as well to help them in what was a desperately sad uprooting of families from their ancestral homes, so that each of these anniversaries has led to new ways of looking at partition. One other thing, which I'm going to say at the beginning, but I'll talk more about it towards the end of the lecture, is that another element in these anniversaries is the increasing role of the diaspora and its interests in partition. I think that's particularly appropriate for this audience, but it's a general tendency that overseas South Asian communities are trying to reconnect younger generations with their past, and many of these communities came from families that were uprooted as a result of the 1947 partition. So some of the work that's now being done is very much driven by this diasporic interest in reconnection. And I would imagine going forward to the 75th anniversary, I'm going to talk more about this at the end, that element will become ever more present in writings about partition. But before we go on to look at what's going to happen perhaps in writings, I want to talk a little bit about some of the main themes of the last 30 years or so of work on partition, and how my own writings, in a sense, is almost a sort of history moving along with the historiography of partition. When I started out work, as I say, in the late 1970s, early 1980s, there wasn't really the volume of study on partition that there is today. There certainly wasn't the concern about ordinary people and how they experience partition. It was very much about the role of the political parties, leading figures like Gandhi, Nehru, Jinnah, how they sort of approached the end of empire, and why partition perhaps came about as a result of their political stances. There was also a gradual interest also in the Mountbatten viceroyalty, a very controversial viceroyalty. All the Mountbatten papers are held at the University of Southampton. And there's actually new areas that could be mined in terms of Mountbatten's perhaps approach to partition there. But this was very much the writing in the 1970s and 1980s about what's sometimes called the high politics of partition. Why it happened, what was the role of particular parties and individuals in this process. And of course, there was a certain amount of blame apportionment in all of this. As the historian Aisha Jalal writes, sometimes there's a made in Pakistan history and a made in India history about partition. It's inevitable, you know, that there's going to be this dimension to something which is so controversial, had such long lasting effects, which are still there today, you know, and was so momentous. So there's bound to be that element of blame attached. It could be blame attached to the British for the chaotic way in which they left. It could be blame attached if you were a Pakistani writer. You would attach the blame to Indian inflexibility. If you were an Indian writer, or vice versa, you would be talking about Jinnah, you know, and why was it that he was not prepared to compromise his position, you know, and there was his obstructionism that led to the partition and all the tragedies. So you can see that there's this contentious, almost polemical element there in the writing on partition. And in a sense, I think what's happened since the 1980s is that many of these more polemical positions have begun to be interrogated, and this universalized high politics view of partition has begun to be replaced by looking at much more localized understandings. What did it mean for local people living in Amritsar? What did it mean for local people living in Lahore? That was one of the things that I was concerned about in my book, Divided Cities. And I was very fortunate to be able to visit both those cities, you know, as an outsider. This is where there are some advantages in being, there are disadvantages in being an outsider writing about these events, but there's also some advantages because you can actually cross over the border, you can do research on both sides, and you can get a bigger picture, perhaps, than just one view of what's happening from the perspective of your community, your country. So that these local studies were beginning to question these wider understandings, and we're beginning to show that perhaps this is such a complex situation that you can't easily apportion blame and say it's all because of one individual that things break down. You begin to see longer patterns as well, patterns which may even be contradictory, that patterns in which communities are suspicious of each other, unable to trust each other, but also patterns where on a local level people may have very warm relationships, may cooperate with each other, and in a sense show that when we look back through the prism of partition, we may see a very different understanding of Punjab than what was there on the ground. You know, in 1947 itself, things were much more fluid in the late colonial period. And I think that element is a big contribution which has come out of these new studies in the last 20 or 30 years. Plus, of course, if you start looking at local incidences of violence, for example, which a lot of this work is done in the last 20 or 30 years, there again, you can see that you can't just blame one community for this. It's much more complex. All communities have their aggressors, all communities have their victims. You know, that's the reality of the situation. You know, it may be it's not about religion at all. It may be about other things, local power struggles. It may be that some of the violence is very much organized and orchestrated. Other violence is spontaneous. You can't just say that it's a temporary madness, which is the way writers in the past looked at it. It's much more complex. There's all these elements there. Opportunistic grabbing of women, of looting property. That's one dimension of the violence, but another dimension might be a political purpose. But that might not necessarily be the same political purpose as national leaders have. And national leaders may not even know what's going on at a more grassroots level. So everything is much more complicated, you know, than these earlier accounts, you know, which were just blaming someone or some group, some political party, some organization for violence. And I think that in one sense, if we want to sum up what's coming out of a lot of the writing of the last 20, 30 years, it is that we've got to understand the partition experience in a multi-layered, complex way, as not just a single event confined to August 1947, but a process which is still, in a sense, being worked out today. You know, and there's still communities still who are affected nearly 75 years later. So that this is a much more long-term historical process that we're talking about. Wazir Zamindar, someone whose writings I'm sure you've heard of, talks about the long partition. It's a much more longer lasting process. And it's also a process which is incredibly complex. When you actually start to uncover the various layers of elements within it, it's not a simplistic religious struggle. It's not a simplistic political struggle necessarily either. It's not just this sort of suddenly being overtaken by madness, because there is planning. as well as spontaneity in the violence. So that this is, I think, one factor which has come out in the work. And of course, people like Urvashi Bhattalia, The Other Side of Silence, started to uncover the gender dimension of partition. She began to look at its impact on children, on Dalits. There are other writers that came along, Ritu Menon, Kamala Bhasin, who were looking at women in terms of how they were treated, not just by their abductors, but by the state bureaucracies when they were trying to recover them as part of the process of the state re-establishing its legitimacy after this total loss of power at the transition from British rule. Both the Indian state and the Pakistani state couldn't do the basic things, which were to protect their populations, because of course Hindus living in Pakistan were initially, until they were driven away, they will be citizens of that state, and of course they remain so in the eastern wing of the country, although not in the west of the country. So that the state's inability to protect its minorities, it had to somehow or other justify itself, and one way was to try and restore things which had been broken. So return abducted women, whether they wanted to be returned or not. That's the point that Menon and Bhasin sort of make it in their work. It was about trying to reorder hierarchies, because of course, potentially, partition could have very much unsettled society. And both the Indian state and the Pakistan state were about reordering hierarchies. So you had the establishment of different kinds of rehabilitation processes for people depending on what caste they were in the Indian context. You had camps with areas set aside for untouchables in India, for example. You had single women who had lost all their family members were treated in a patriarchal way by the state, who stepped in as loco parentis for them. You had a situation where certainly poorer refugees were allocated different kinds of temporary accommodation, and longer term, even permanent accommodation. So that when these satellite towns were built by both India and Pakistan and refugee colonies, they gave plots of land and the size of houses and the facilities depending on the wealth, as they saw it, of the refugees. So that was re-establishing a hierarchy. So both states are very much in that business of trying to re-establish order, re-establish hierarchy after this chaotic sort of transition from colonial rule. That's another theme which has come out of writings on the immediate aftermath of partition. If you look at the work of someone like Ravinder Kaur, for example, who's written on Delhi, you'll see very much there she talks about the ways in which there is a very differentiated treatment of people who are refugees, depending on their status. She also brings out the fact, and here's another way in which a sort of universalized view of partition breaks down, how people had access after the violence had subsided, if they were from an elite background. G.D. Khosla, she quotes, Lahore High Court judge, person who wrote about partition, Stern Reckoning, his famous book on partition. He actually went back with a Gurkha escort to Lahore to retrieve all his valuables, which had been stored for him in the Lahore High Court. Now, you couldn't have ordinary refugees doing that. So you see the ways in which there is this very differentiated process of both resettlement, but also ability to recover losses at the time of partition. And this comes out in the work of Ravinder Kaur. And she was also, I think, the first writer that talked about the fact that whilst all of the iconic portrayals of refugee migration are in terms of people trudging in these vast foot columns, sometimes with their bullock carts, sometimes with nothing other than what they can carry, or on these crowded trains. You see all the iconic pictures of the people on the roofs of the trains. It's very much part of the image of partition. But Ravinder Kaur talks about people flying over the border, and that civil servants and people who could afford it could fly from places like Peshawar to Delhi. They were able to do this, and these are not inconsiderable numbers of people. British Overseas Airways Corporation, the old BOAC, I think Ravinder Kaur says transported about 18,000 people. With thinking of all the airlifts out of Kabul at the moment, and it's a sort of similar but less chaotic situation for people who are able to get over the border, in this instance in 1947, relatively unscathed, if they can afford an air ticket, if they have the connections, political connections. I recall looking at one letter that's in the Mountbatten papers, which covers the post-independence period, because of course Mountbatten stayed on, as you know, as Governor General of India Governor General, not Viceroy anymore, of India, independent India. And Nehru's correspondence was copied to him on some issues, and Nehru took it into his head to make a personal complaint to the Pakistan government when a plane that was carrying VIP refugees from Pakistan to India got into engine trouble. It was going from Peshawar to Delhi. It had to stop in Lahore. When it landed at Lahore, police officials got on the train and removed all the on the plane and removed all the wristwatches and all the jewelry of the people who were the passengers. And Nehru makes this complaint right up to the national level of the Pakistan government about this. But this shows you the differential experiences of migration that's going on, as well as of resettlement. And I think that's one of the key aspects of partition historiography, which has been significant in the last 30 years. There was obviously a universalized experience at one level, but if you dig beneath that, you will see that they're very different stories. The other thing, of course, and this is where I'm going to begin to talk a bit about Bengal, is that there are different patterns of timing of refugee movement. It wasn't known that widely, really until writings in the 1990s, that there was more refugee migration across the new international border in Bengal in 1950 than there was in August 1947. And there are different patterns of migration. Obviously, the Punjab migration is taken to stand for all of the migration processes, but that is in some sense is atypical in terms of its intensity. It's really all over by the end of November 1947. Whereas migration carries on for years, if not decades, in other parts of the subcontinent. And even in Sindh, migration doesn't get underway there until probably January 1948, by which time all the migration is finished in the Punjab region. So that these differences of timing is another one of these differential experiences of the partition process, which has come out in the literature. It's partly to do with levels of violence, levels of tension, because people tend not to migrate unless they have to in these circumstances. there was much more communal tension in Bengal in 1950 than there was in 1947. That's the reason why there was more migration. The other factors, of course, are that the resources which the state governments have and the ways in which the state governments are able to deal with the refugee influx vary greatly. It's almost become a cliche, but there's truth, as there is in most cliches, that the process of resettlement was much smoother in Punjab than in Bengal. And that in a sense, this is partly because of the different long drawn out process of migration in the Bengal region, as opposed to this very intense migration in Punjab. It's also, of course, because there was a sense right from the beginning in the Punjab region that this migration was permanent. So that there was more as an exchange of population under the military evacuation organization auspices after the initial weeks of chaos and the failure of the Punjab boundary force, which one of the things that could be held as a criticism of Mountbatten, but that's a digression. But the failure of that boundary force was a factor in having to have the military evacuation organization set up. But this exchange of population in the Punjab region meant that, that it was very clear that evacuee property and compensation, although it took years in some instances to resolve conflicts nonetheless, but there was a process by which if you left behind property in East Punjab, went into West Punjab, you could get something in compensation for that property and vice versa. That didn't happen in the Bengal region. So there was much less available property. Also, there wasn't the complete, if we're looking at West Bengal, there wasn't the complete movement out of Muslims of West Bengal. So that meant that there was much less property available for incoming refugees. And that's why you get this very different. I'm not a Bengal historian or expert, but you can see the significance of it long term, of the squatter movement, particularly in southern parts of Calcutta, I think, you know, and the criticism of the Congress government of the day by refugees, saying it was more concerned with maintaining landowners' interest than it was in settling refugees. And that was the context in which the CPI was able to gain support amongst refugee communities in West Bengal, and that affected its politics for many years. So you can see these different trajectories of politics and of resettlement if you just compare Punjab and Bengal. And certainly there was nothing about this really written in any detail until the 1980s, late 1980s, early 1990s, where there was this concern then with looking below the national level and the debates about, you know, why partition happened, you know, to actually look at what was occurring on the ground in those areas that became post-independence, West Bengal, East Bengal, and later East Pakistan, now Bangladesh, and of course West Punjab and East Punjab. And I think that that is very important in the new history. That it breaks down stereotypes, breaks down universal sort of narratives, and it enables people to understand how complex this process actually is. And of course, also what comes out of this process is that there are clear winners and losers in this. There are people who are able to take advantage of the economic, quote, opportunities brought by partition, who prosper as a result. There are other individuals who suffer greatly and never recover their fortunes as a result of this setback. I remember when I was doing the work with the interviews with Darshan Singh Tatler for Epicenter of Violence. We were interviewing people in Amritsar who'd moved from Sialkot in Pakistan, and talking to some families there, and they were saying that they were very prosperous prior to partition. They'd lost everything, and they'd never really recovered. This was a generation later. So there are going to be winners, there are going to be losers. And obviously, this comes out in these oral histories, personal testimonies of partition, those who are able to gain, those who suffer, not just in the short term, but we're talking about a long-term suffering as a result of this. And of course, the ramifications are political as well as individual. We've mentioned this with respect to Bengal. In the Bengal region, there's also dispersal of refugees, even as far afield as the Andaman Islands, forested areas of Orissa, Madhya Pradesh. People are dispersed after refugee camps are still having huge numbers of people in them a decade after partition. All the refugee camps closed in Punjab by 1948. They're still probably getting on for 800,000 people in refugee camps in Bengal a decade later. So that you can see how this impacts on states outside of Bengal, where Bengali refugees are sent or dispersed, places like Assam and others. So that there is this long-term political legacy. I don't want to digress, it's a separate topic, but look at Karachi and its politics since 1947. It can't be understood, Karachi's current political situation, without reference to the large Mahajar community in Karachi, and it cannot. That whole region's politics, people like Sarah Ansari have looked at this, the clashes between Mahajars and native Sindhis is a long-term legacy. So all of this, and this is aside from the so-called often unfinished business of partition in Kashmir, which is another topic entirely, but obviously is all part of this sort of post-British departure difficult situation in the subcontinent. All of these things have long-term repercussions. So partition is now understood as something which is important going forward. It's not just a historic event that ends in August 1947, which is the way some of the earlier accounts tended to look at it, because, as I say, they were concentrating very much on why it happened, not what was the consequence of it. Right, I want to spend now 10 or 15 minutes talking about what kind of research there might be going forward as far as partition is concerned, and as we're approaching the 75th anniversary. And I want to set these potential research areas into two contexts, which I think are very important and which have changed things dramatically in terms of the historiography. Obviously, you could say the historiography is always changed by what's happening in the subcontinent itself and the relations between India and Pakistan. But I'm going to be looking at it not from those changes, which are obviously important. We've heard of sort of in the last week or two, the way in which memories of what 1947 is could become politicized. I don't want to talk about that, but to look at two, I think, quite significant contextual changes for the historiography, and then how this might work out. I've already mentioned the first one, but I just reiterate it, and that is certainly within the United States and within Britain, much of the work and interest in partition now is driven by the South Asian diaspora. That's a factor which has become very significant, certainly in the last 20 years, partly because of the younger generation wanting to reconnect with their past, and there are significant communities living in those places that were most affected by partition and its upheaval. But also, of course, there increasingly are within academia historians of South Asian background from the diaspora originally, who are working on aspects of partition. And they've certainly helped to drive the concern of the human dimension and concerns with migration and longer term legacies. And also, what do these borders mean in an increasingly world in which, at least through information technology, borders are broken down to an extent, and that the IT revolution has also, I think, transformed the context in which work on partition takes place, along with the growth of social media. Now, what do I mean by that? When I was sort of first going out collecting interviews, you did it with an audio cassette player. No sort of MP3, no mobile phone, no digitization. It was all done in a very, what we now call primitive manner. You couldn't immediately put out there the material that you collected. It was very much your own private collection. You might later on either publish it, or you might give it to a sort of archive. But it was a very different world, and it was a much slower world in terms of production of knowledge. The IT revolution has been associated, obviously, with the rise of social media, and this in turn has given to what I would call two factors: commodification of knowledge, of partition. And this is an interesting point that one of my former students, Pippa Verdi, has raised recently about what she calls the partition industry that's emerged. In other words, there's more and more material that's being produced, and in terms of oral memories. This is sometimes being housed by universities. I'm thinking of universities like Stanford, Partition Archive, Harvard, and you have to pay to access that information. So there is this commodification of knowledge. Also, I think there is this concept of crowdfunding in order to secure interviews, citizen historians. Now, at one level, this is all good news. It's making things more accessible. It's opening things up. On the other hand, I think it also can have downsides in that it reopens some of the issues which Urvashi Bhattalia, way back when she was sort of doing her pioneering studies, had to try and address the ethical questions. Are you trained to be able to interview people about traumatic episodes in their family history? You know, are you using their tragedies in order to further your own particular interest or your own particular agenda? And I think that these issues, which obviously Bhattalia addressed to a certain extent, are going to be very much there, you know, going forward in terms of vast amounts of material being generated in this way, and to what purpose. There's also another trend, which is sort of linked with all of this, which again, in some respects is very positive, but can also raise difficult questions. And that is people telling their histories through material objects. You know, we have the Partition Museum in Amritsar, for example, that has opened. There's academic studies now which try and talk about partition through people remembering it through items they brought with them across the border. Now, all of this is fine, but the thing is that in a way, what it does is it perhaps perpetuates an elitist vision of partition. That's all right if you were wealthy enough or were able to bring belongings. What about if you didn't have anything? You know, are you excluded from this new way of understanding partition as a result? How much are you perpetuating an upper middle class understanding of partition, which may not, of course, be any more universal than the state narrative constructions of partition had been previously. So these are issues which need to be carefully thought through, I think, as well as to see them as positive developments. Okay, two areas which I think are important now. Firstly, an environmental dimension, and secondly, I want to talk about not the diaspora in terms of collecting material or being interested in writing history, but how overseas communities at that time were affected by partition. The environmental dimension, there has been work done by people like Daniel Haynes, David Gilmartin on the Indus Basin and how partition impacted on integrated canal networks in Punjab. But there are other dimensions as well, which I think are quite important. And an argument which I'm trying to develop via Lahore, but I think it might hold in other urban contexts as well, is that the legacy of partition in terms of how cities were rebuilt after considerable physical destruction. 10,000 buildings were destroyed in Amritsar in the pre-partition violence. That was probably the worst affected city, then Multan and then Lahore. How these cities were rebuilt, does this impact on current environmental concerns relating to urban development? This is very important in the context of climate change. How much were colonial era attitudes to planning perpetuated after partition? Did these colonial era attitudes to planning actually lead to things like ribbon development, which in itself, you might say, well, so what? Why is that a problem? Well, it is if it makes reliance on private cars as a means of transport in the absence of integrated transport networks. It raises issues of toxic air quality, pollution, which is there. I'm not saying that car use is the only factor for the smog across Punjab and Delhi each winter. There's other factors as well, but that's one factor. And obviously it's exacerbated by climate change and the greater moisture in the air and higher temperatures. Another legacy, certainly in Lahore, but it may hold up in other urban environments, I don't know, it is that in the colonial era, there were these suburbs which were developed. Model Town would be the obvious one, but there are others as well. And most of the building was for the wealthy classes, upper middle class and above. there wasn't much building for working class communities. So there was already a massive housing shortage before all the violence of partition and before the massive influx of refugees, because of course Lahore ended up with over 50% of its population being refugees in the early years. That came out in the 51 census. Obviously since then there's been mass migration from throughout Pakistan, but I would say there's a kind of path established of a shortage of housing, which leads to informal settlements, the poor settling themselves. This in itself, again, isn't a bad thing, but what it does do, as it can both prevent major plans which are trying to organize urban growth. It can disrupt those, and it can also lead to encroachments and people being settled in areas which are low-lying, flood liable, blockage of natural drainage systems, etc. And of course, all of this is there. There's lots of floods. If you read through the newspapers of the 1950s, you'll see of Punjab, there's lots of flooding episodes. What's happened in recent years, of course, is all of this is greatly mushroomed with massive population increase, rural-urban migration, climate change, so that you get these great flooding events. I mean, obviously, always historically, there's been floods in the monsoon period. I'm not trying to say this is something new, but what is now called man-made pluvial flooding, I think, in other words, flooding not through rivers, but just through concretization of cities, blockage of drainage systems, encroachments, all of that has intensified. And I would say that if we're going to look at the long-term psychological, political consequences of partition, perhaps we should also look at what its long-term environmental legacies were, and to see that there's some element in that. So I think that's an area where there will be more research done. The city hasn't featured in environmental history in South Asia. It's always been about rivers, forests. It's not been about urban centers, but as global warming regrettably becomes more and more of a problem, then city life can become more and more intolerable. And I think that the city and the environment will be an area the historians will look at, and they may look at it through the long-term perspective of legacies of colonial rule and partition, and how city administrations attempted to deal with this unprecedented influx of refugees after partition. Finally, and very quickly, because I don't want to cut into time for questions, the diaspora, I've already mentioned in terms of the new techniques of oral history, the interest in the history from below of diasporic communities. There is also, I think, a whole area that intersects with some of the work on the post-colonial Indian and Pakistan state, which is about, as people like Joya Chatterjee, Sarah Ansari, William Gould, and others have shown recently, about how citizenship was influenced in the immediate aftermath of partition by refugee communities and migration. How did overseas Indian communities, how was their citizenship status impacted by the fact of partition? How was their community relations, when these were mixed communities, impacted by partition? Also, and I think there is evidence of this, particularly with established areas of South Asian settlements in Southeast Asia, places like Hong Kong and Singapore. How did partition encourage long distance migration? Obviously, there's a lot of work on how partition led to migration between India and Pakistan, and indeed internal displacement and migration within those two countries. That's also important. But how were long distance migration affected by partition? And I think that is quite significant. And there's certainly evidence, if you read the Straits Times, the main English language newspaper in Singapore for 1948, there's quite a few articles which look at things like Sindhis invade Singapore. That's one of the headlines in the paper. These were people who had come initially from Pakistan. They had difficult resettlement experiences in Bombay. So they then migrated to Singapore, where there wasn't a small pre-existing Sindhi commercial community. And the Straits Times is picking up on these people coming in. And the same thing happened to a certain extent with the Sikh community as well. And also there seemed to be interesting reports in the Straits Times of Singaporean Sikhs going to independent India, Punjab, not being able to settle there, and going back to Singapore. And by going back to Singapore, they actually encouraged some West Punjab refugees, Sikhs, to also go to Singapore. So you can see how there is this possibility for looking at long distance migration. And Sindhis, certainly there was a significant Sindhi migration to Hong Kong by partition migrants. So you can see that there are possibilities there. I'm not saying that we're dealing with huge numbers of people, but I suspect that with the diaspora's growing interest in history of their families and communities, this will be an area that could be certainly further explored, and it could be done through not just newspaper accounts. I mentioned the Straits Times, but I think if you went to the National Archives in Singapore, you would see there's quite a lot of oral histories are being collected there already by Singaporean South Asians, and some of these people, their history actually starts in Singapore in 1948-9, and from that we have to say, well, there's got to be some linkage probably with partition as a result of that chronology. One final point to leave you with, really just to draw attention to something, not to see it as a major research issue, but it's part of this technological turn, as I've called it. The Research and Activist Initiative originated in Oxford, called Project Dastan. I don't know if you've come across that. This is recording partition testimonies leading up to the 75th anniversary. And interestingly, what it's doing is it's reconnecting the people who are interviewed, the respondents, with their exact childhood locations, which they may not have visited through virtual reality technology, so that they film these areas as they are today, and then they show the people the films of these areas which they may have been unable to access I think that's interesting. There's also a plan by this project to produce a documentary experience, a VR documentary experience, putting the viewer in the shoes of a 1947 migrant. And the plan is to distribute this to film festivals and museums worldwide. So I think that is an interesting development. But I'm going to finish on that point because I don't want to take up time for people who may have questions they want to raise. So thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to you.
Thank you, Professor Ian Talbot. Thank you for giving us such a comprehensive take on the kind of historiography that has happened about partition and around partition, and how it has grown and evolved, and how with time it has become more subtle in foregrounding the different dimensions of the experience of partition. For instance, the experience of women, and how caste and class hierarchies influenced the experience of partition. And lastly, what future course could partition studies take in the 21st centuries? And as Professor Arvind said in his introductory remarks, that such complex events like partition always have long-term effects on cultures, on communities, on societies, on individuals. And sometimes some communities or some cultures are able to recover, but sometimes for other cultures and other communities, it becomes rather difficult to recover from the tragedy of this kind of experience. And this has been quite an interesting 1 hour, right? So now we'll take up questions. I'll read out the questions to you, Professor Ian Talbot. Right, we do have a few questions. So
right.
This is a question from Karan Ojla, right? So he says that it has been 74 years since the partition, and currently the Indo-Pak relations seem close to reaching a boiling point. So, and considering the recent developments in Afghanistan, what do you think is the future of a reunited India in the classical sense? Pakistan has a snake in its backyard now. Will it push it towards us or towards better Sino-Pak relations? So what will be the impact of the developments in Afghanistan on, how do you see this?
I think from a Pakistan point of view, there are conflicting opportunities, but also dangers about what's happening in Afghanistan. What I would say is that certainly the danger for Pakistan is that the Pakistan Taliban, which are based in Afghanistan and are anti-state, may step up their terrorist activities across the border. I think this is a danger for Pakistan, and they're very aware of this. And Pakistan is pressing for an inclusive government in Afghanistan. And the reason for that is, although there may be some within Pakistan who favor the Taliban over other groups, nonetheless, they don't want a destabilized state on their doorstep, with a civil war raging, which could create opportunities for terrorist groups who want to strike at Pakistan to do so. So that's a challenging situation. I suppose if you look at it from a more positive perspective, if you were sitting in Islamabad, it would be something like they were concerned about India's growing influence in Afghanistan, especially with respect to how that would impact on the very delicate situation in Baluchistan. So anything which apparently diminishes Indian influence in Afghanistan would be to Pakistan's advantage. So as with all the other regional players, I think that there's the situation is incredibly volatile. It could go in a number of different directions. It's not clear yet which way that is going to happen. And there are downsides, certainly for Pakistan. It's not a simplistic, well, they created the Taliban, so it's all going to be an upside for them. It's far more complicated than that. So I think that's the position. Of course, one other thing about China, which is important to bear in mind, and that is that they talk about the Chinese-Pakistan relationship as an iron friendship. This is the term that's often used and has been used very recently. China doesn't want to see Afghanistan an area where Uyghur sort of militant groups can operate from. So there's that issue. Also, China, through its ambassador, actually, has been publicly, and this is unusual, publicly voicing criticism of Pakistan and its lack of security for Chinese citizens in Pakistan. Because I don't know if you've been following this news or not, but in the last few weeks, there's been a number of terrorist attacks in which Chinese interests, mainly around the CPEC sort of infrastructure, Chinese firms, Chinese workmen have been targeted, so that all of this is just complicating. What is already an incredibly complicated situation. As I say, it could play out in very different ways. But I think some of the reporting in the West, of this as being to Pakistan's advantage is not true to the reality on the ground, and that Pakistan does have real issues about what happens in Afghanistan. Whether that encourages better relations with India, which would be one positive thing, is again very difficult to predict, whether that's the case. I mean, obviously, relations are not good at the moment, but anyone who's known what's happened over the past 74 years, know that there are these cycles or peaks and troughs, for want of a better word, and just because you're in a trough, it doesn't mean to say that things are always stuck there. There are possibilities for sort of improvement as well. So I think what I'm trying to say is that it's as complicated as partition in many senses, multi-layered situation.
Right. Okay, so there is another question. I find it interesting. So the question is, what are your research methods in your work? I would like to add to this, like which research methods do you use in your research work? For instance, you said that there has been a development of the collection of oral testimonies, with reference to partition. So how do you compare, this kind of historiography that relies more on oral testimony, and how do you compare it with traditional historiography, where the oral testimonies were not that much relevant? So when it comes to research methods with reference to historiography, so how do you see this comparison or this development?
I think that there's obviously some people who would see oral history and testimony as less reliable than documentary testimony. Having said that, documents are written often for a political purpose with an agenda behind them. They find their way into archives and are open to scholars. Other things aren't open to scholars, so that we can't just say that because it's a documentary source, it's bound to be reliable, and because it's a personal testimony, it's going to be unreliable. I think that what is important with personal testimonies is that you're not necessarily getting historical fact, if there's such a thing as historical fact, from them. What you're getting is how people remember, how people perceived at the time, what they choose to remember, perhaps also what they might choose to forget. The silences are also as important, perhaps sometimes, as what is actually said. So a historian really, this is where I have some problems with people who haven't been trained in oral history methodology, just going around collecting stories and then using them, to construct a narrative without realizing what the limitations are, what you can do with oral testimonies, and what you can't do with them. And I think that's always important. I mean, what I experienced, as I said, way back in the 90s when I was collecting material for the Divided Cities book, was that there was always a tendency amongst people to either exaggerate their losses as a result of partition, and to show that they'd made a recovery, and that we had nothing and look what we've now achieved, or if they didn't do that, they would sometimes sort of be very quiet about the role of the state and the way in which the state may actually have helped them, so that they were talking about self-reliance and everything was achieved, because of our hard work. And then when you dug around a bit more, you actually found, that they had got state assistance, in terms of perhaps overseeing exchange of documents relating to property, which enabled them to be compensated, for what they'd lost, that kind of thing. So that I think that you need to treat oral testimonies, with care. That doesn't mean to say that they can't illuminate aspects of the partition experience in a way that perhaps a documentary record won't, because it's about a human being, it's about a person, it's not about a load of statistics, and in a sense I think that's the value of it, but it's got to be treated carefully, and there isn't necessarily I think an easy answer as to what is better. I think you need to use both. Certainly, you could check if someone was giving a testimony and it obviously didn't fit, the established facts, so to speak, of a particular situation or event. Then you would know immediately if you had that background contextual knowledge. The point that I'm making is some of the people who might be collecting testimonies might not have that detail of background to be able to test whether the story that they're being told is accurate or not.
Right. So the next question is in Punjabi. I would translate it for you. So of course you have talked about it, but still there is this question: is it really possible to fix responsibility when it comes to partition? I mean, of course you refer to it. I mean, is it really possible? Because who were the people who were responsible? Can we say, I mean, the political leaders or somehow? I mean, how do we sort this out?
I mean, one of the I'll answer that in part. I mean, some of the interviews, again, going back to the interviews that were quite striking that I collected on both sides of the border, were to blame the politicians and to say that we were actually living, I think they probably exaggerate the degree of harmony, but they were living not in total conflict with people from other communities, and that politicians, they argue, for their own power, were sort of manipulating divisions, and so that comes across in quite a lot of interviews. I'm not saying that because it's there in a lot of interviews it's right, but there was certainly a perception that some people held. I think it would depend again where you were living. If you were living in a rural community, it might have been more harmonious naturally than perhaps in an urban context. Because I mean, a lot of these differences between communities were not really religious as such, but they were about economic interests, access to jobs, that kind of thing. But obviously they became coloured and could be manipulated, in a religious framework. And I think that is a factor in this. But that doesn't answer the question. I don't think there's a straightforward answer, in the sense of it was the British fault, or it was a Muslim League's fault, or it was a Congress fault. All of these answers, are far too simplistic.
Right. The next question is there any relationship between partition triggered violence against women and children and civilizational discipline and structural violence done to have-nots?
I think that one of the issues, of course, is loot, as I mentioned, and it will obviously be wealthier communities. You're not going to get Dalit communities who are going to get looted. That may be an explanation why they suffered less violence, perhaps, than other communities. So there are other factors as well. Why is it that certain communities were outside of the violence? Why weren't Anglo-Indians targeted, for example? I think that the violence was at different levels. It was the political level, a struggle for power. If you weren't powerful or you weren't competing, then you were less likely as a community to be targeted. So Parsis, for example, are not going to be targeted. Perhaps Anglo-Indians, because they're not making claims for power. So that's at the political level of the violence. At the sort of social level of violence, the loot level, then obviously it would be communities which had more conspicuous wealth or had bad relationships with neighboring communities, paying back old scores. That was another factor in the violence these local studies are showing. Obviously, the ability to defend yourself. The violence could be directed towards communities which were seen as softer targets. So that as with all of this related to partition, there isn't a simple sort of correlation here. It depends on a variety of things. What are the local power relationships like? What are the local community relationships like? Who are the wealthy? Are there powerful people in a local community who see there's no advantage served by violence? There's been some interesting work done on Miller Kotler, which was not involved in the violence in 1947. People like Pippa Verdi, Anna Bigelow have worked on Miller Kotler, and have said that there was partly because of the Nawab, who was a Muslim, but of this very small state surrounded by Sikh majority areas. He had no personal interest in trying to have violence in his area. He tried to dampen it down. He used the state forces where he could, to do that. So incentives for violence or disincentives for violence, they're also important. So each context is slightly different. I'll just say one final thing on this particular point. There was an interesting study by Stephen Wilkinson on military recruitment and violence. He made the argument those districts of Punjab which had a higher proportion of Second World War combatants were more prone to violence than other areas, because some of these people came back with their weapons. They were used to killing. They were organized, and they were certainly available for those people who might have had political motives for utilizing violence. So that's a possible factor as well.
Right, sir. One last question. How do the images entrenched in the cultural memory of people, related to partition through the many verbal and visual narratives impede the understanding of the differential experience of partition?
I think that what has happened is that there emerged what I call iconic images, which come to stand for the whole refugee experience, and it often these were taken by Western photographers. Actually, Margaret Bork White, famous American photographer, took many images of partition, some of which she actually staged in order to put a dramatic effect across. And these came to stand for a universal experience of partition. It could be of people trudging along on the roadside, carrying their scanty possessions with them, or giving sort of physical assistance to children, carrying them on their backs, or older people. Not everyone had that experience, or could be these iconic photographs, as I mentioned, I think in my talk, of crowded trains, with people sitting on the roofs of the carriages. These have become iconic symbols of partition. Yet not all partition migrants trudged across the border on foot. Not all of them went by train. We've already mentioned some flew. If you're looking at Bengal, it would be a case of people going by steamer. A lot of Hindus migrated from Sindh via ship, and ended up in Bombay or Porbandar, places like that. So that, there are these different experiences which are not captured so much as images. And it's these common images, which seem to stand for the whole of the partition experience.
Okay, thank you, sir. So we are lucky that Professor Elena Nesbitt has also joined us. And before I request Professor Nesbitt to make an intervention in this regard, I think Professor Arvind, the Vice Chancellor, Punjabi University, Patiala, wants to make an intervention. Professor Arvind, sir?
No, I think I'll make it after the formal intervention is over.
Okay. All right, sir. So now I would like to request Professor Elena Nesbitt to make an intervention in this regard, what we have been discussing for the last 1 hour: partition studies, their future, the attempt to understand partition from new perspectives. So Professor Nesbitt.
Well, I'm very honored to be included, but I haven't had the benefit, of course, of hearing the lecture. I hope that I will be able to catch up on that. What is striking me at the moment is there seems to be well, certainly I've read 2 publications recently, Lena Dhingra's and Marina Wheeler's, which seem to sort of combine autobiography and historical discovery, and maybe even some imaginative interludes as well. And I suspect that this is a growing genre as people who are competent professionals and writers realize that the memories within their own family are disappearing, or that they are only just becoming aware themselves of the silent partition history that previous generations have avoided articulating because it was too painful to them. But for this generation, the sort of Marina Wheeler, Lena Dhingra generation, it's somehow it's raw, but it has a different type of resonance because there's this element of discovery rather than of actual memory. So I'm just aware of that, being very much on the edges of this field of partition studies. And I suppose I'm also, because of the news from Afghanistan, I suppose I'm beginning to think, will people soon be sort of finding parallels between these 2 histories of carnage and loss and dislocation, actually within basically South Asia. So I've just got these queries that are surfacing in my own mind, but not on the basis of what I'm sure has been a really important discussion and Professor Talbot's input that you've all had the benefit of.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, ma'am.
Can I just respond quickly to Eleanor?
Yes.
Yes.
Sir.
I think that family histories and autobiographies, which is the point that Eleanor made, will be a growing area, certainly looking to 75 years and beyond. I think that is a growth area, certainly.
You're right, sir. Professor Gera Roy, do you want to make an intervention?
No, I just wanted to introduce Professor Elena Nesbitt. For those who don't know, I've posted it because I thought there might be no time. Professor Elena Nesbitt is Professor Emeritus at the Center for Education Studies, University of Warwick. She belongs to a number of, it's difficult to read from there, just a minute. She belongs to a number of research networks in Europe and beyond, including the British Association for the Study of Religion, Punjab. She is a founder member of the Punjab Research Group. She gave the Swarthmore Lecture 2003, the annual SACR lecture in 1992, and in Truro in 2000. And she's lectured and spoken at conferences in Britain, Canada, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, South Africa, Sweden, and the US. She speaks on the radio and acts as a consultant for radio and television programs, as well as for publishers and solicitors. She's on the editorial board of Fieldwork in Religion and Religions of South Asia. But that's a formal introduction, but I would say that Professor Eleanor is one of the leading scholars in religious studies who has not only done pioneering work on South Asian religions, not just Sikhism, Hinduism, but all the other sects which are found in the diaspora. And not only that, most scholars who have done work in Punjab studies, she's been associated with Punjab studies as a founder member of Punjab Research Group. And all the diasporic scholars that Professor Talbot was talking about, the second generation, she has mentored all of them. So all the great work that has been coming from the diaspora is because of the encouragement and support and guidance which Eleanor has given. It's appropriate that I really wanted Eleanor to be here for this because I met Ian at Eleanor's place when I first met you in 2008. We did talk about it when we were catching up, but thank you so much for being able to join despite all your other engagements. I really appreciate that.
Thank you so much, and my apologies for appearing so close to the end, but that was unavoidable, I'm afraid.
Right, thank you, ma'am. Yes, now I would request Professor Arvind to make a comment.
Yeah, so
yes.
Rarely get a chance to attend an entire seminar because of my engagements, but since this was a kind of a evening program, I managed to participate in the whole event. I'm really thankful the way it went. I want to make the following remarks. Number one, that the geopolitical design behind the partition should not be underestimated. It is very clear that this country or the subcontinent underwent a partition because of the British design. And British were continuously grappling with their rivalry with the Russians and later on with Soviets. And this is now well documented from the British Parliament accounts that what was going on in the British mind about a superpowers emerging in this region under the influence of Soviet Union. So that's the one point which should not be underestimated, that it was by design and not by anything else that this subcontinent got partitioned. The second watershed understanding that one develops here is about Sikh religion. Sikh religion before 1947, through its entire history, has been a very different concept.
ever since the 10th Guru invented the concept of Sant Sipahi, even during the wars, Sikh armies did not kill civilians. Sikh armies did not loot the way other armies loot. So all the principle of Sikhism were violated by Sikhs in 1947, and it was actually validated by the Sikh dominant clergy and religious bodies. So this was a very, very major deviation and a very major surprise which one did not expect, given the long history of the Sikh traditions. So much so that somebody like Gail Singh Chajalwaddi, who was involved with saving Muslim people who were migrating to Pakistan, was dragged behind a jeep and killed by the Sikh leader, killed under the orders of the Sikh clergy leaders, that this is not the kind of people that we want. So this, in some sense, was a major shift in the whole paradigm of the Sikh philosophy, which I think the Sikh community has not yet even analyzed or reconciled. These 2 points I wanted to make because we are talking about partition. And of the third point, which I want to emphasize, which was made by the main speaker, that the division between haves and have-nots continued. Even with all the anarchy and the violence and the order which broke down, finally, it was identified what property you had in the other country, and accordingly, the allotments for land and property were made. So that's also very significant that the momentary disturbance and the lack of order did not disturb the property relations among people, and a similar hierarchy of caste and wealth were re-established very quickly. So I thought I'll make these 3 points just to give you 3 different aspects of this partition that will complement and also supplement the discussion which happened today. I think we should engage it with much more discussions of this variety and introspect as communities who have undergone this whole experience and see what we can learn from it.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. I think the 3 points are very pertinent. The role of the Britishers cannot be overlooked. This is something that we need to take into account whenever it comes to partition. The second point is again very relevant, and this is something that I would like Professor Nesbitt to respond to if she wants to. I mean, how such tragic events can shape and influence communities' relationship and perception towards their own religion. I mean, as Professor Arvind mentioned, that for a long time, Sikhism was entirely a different kind of experience for the Sikhs. But when it comes to such tragic experiences, the whole perception and the relationship towards their own religion, it undergoes a radical change. I mean, is it really possible to make sense of this kind of transformation, Professor Nesbitt?
That's a really interesting question. I think we're in danger, perhaps, of making comparisons between ideals and principles and teachings on the one hand, and behavior, and particularly behavior in times of crisis, on the other. And I think if one looked at any faith tradition, the history of any religiously identified community, one would actually be making quite similar observations. I mean, you could think about Jesus Christ and the many wars in which Christians have been implicated. So I think it's a massive subject. But I would also say that if you look at the history of the 19th century, you find soldiers who were identified as Sikh behaving in a variety of ways. For example, you only have to look at diary accounts of 1857. I've been looking at women's accounts, the accounts of women who were, for example, in Lucknow and Delhi and so on. And there are Sikhs behaving in a whole range of ways, courageously and generously and disloyally and loyally and cruelly and kindly and so on. that surely is the nature of human beings. And if you have anything that's, for example, purporting now to be a world religion, you're going to have massive variations in behavior. And I think looking at Partition, one should look at all the anecdotal accounts, at least, of huge generosity, bravery, and so on, not just on the part of Sikhs and Hindus in relation to Muslims, but on the part of Muslims in relation to Sikhs and Hindus. There are so many stories of individual courage and altruism, as well as the accounts of apparent deviation from the noblest principles of the religions concerned.
Right, ma'am. So I think after listening to Professor Ian Talbot and Professor Elena Nesbitt and Professor Arvind's interventions, what I can say is events like Partition are so complex. When it afterwards. So now I
We can't hear you.
Am I audible?
No, sir, you are not audible.
Just, connectivity. Am I audible now?
Now you're audible. Yes.
Okay.
IT.
Okay. Sorry, I lost connectivity. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. I would now Professor Gurmukh, vote of thanks, Professor Gurmukh.
Okay, Taramjeet, Dr. Roy, can you hear me?
I can hear you very clearly. Please go on.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Taramjeet. Before I start the formal vote of thanks, I would like to share some thoughts on the lecture and on the partition, but that will be in Punjabi. I think Professor Talbot and Professor Nesbitt will not mind. ਹਮੇਸ਼ਾ ਹੀ ਇਹ ਗੱਲ ਜਦੋਂ ਅਸੀਂ ਪਾਰਟੀਸ਼ਨ ਤੇ ਸੁਣਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਤਾਂ ਕੁਝ ਯਾਦਾਂ ਤਾਜ਼ਾ ਹੋ ਜਾਂਦੀਆਂ ਨੇ। ਇਹ ਗੱਲ ਕਲੀਅਰ ਹੈ ਇਸ ਲੈਕਚਰ ਤੋਂ ਬਾਅਦ ਬਹੁਤ ਇੰਟਰਸਟਿੰਗ ਲੈਕਚਰ ਸੀ ਤੇ ਬਹੁਤ ਹੀ ਇੰਟਰਸਟਿੰਗ ਕੁਐਸਚਨ ਆਨਸਰ ਹੋਏ ਨੇ ਕਿ ਪਾਰਟੀਸ਼ਨ ਨੂੰ ਲਗਾਤਾਰ ਸਮਝਣਾ ਚਾਹੀਦਾ ਤੇ ਜਦੋਂ ਸਮਝਣਾ ਤਾਂ ਇਹਦੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਮਲਟੀ ਲੇਅਰਡ ਇਹਦੀ ਹੋਂਦ ਆ ਉਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਹੀ ਸਮਝਿਆ ਜਾ ਸਕਦਾ। ਇਸ ਨੂੰ ਅਸੀਂ ਕਿਸੇ ਇੱਕ ਪਰਤ ਦੇ ਜ਼ਿੰਮੇ ਲਾ ਕੇ ਖਤਮ ਨਹੀਂ ਕਰ ਸਕਦੇ। ਸੋ ਇਹ ਪੁਆਇੰਟ ਬਹੁਤ ਜ਼ੋਰ ਨਾਲ ਉੱਭਰ ਕੇ ਸਾਹਮਣੇ ਆਇਆ। ਦੂਸਰੀ ਗੱਲ ਕਿ ਜਦੋਂ ਅਸੀਂ ਪ੍ਰੋਫੈਸਰ ਟੈਲਬਟ ਵਰਗੇ ਵਿਦਵਾਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਬੁਲਾਉਂਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਜਾਂ ਨੈਸਬਿਟ ਵਰਗੇ ਵਿਦਵਾਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਤਾਂ ਉਹਦੀ ਖਾਸੀਅਤ ਇਹ ਹੁੰਦੀ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਜਦੋਂ ਅਸੀਂ ਭਾਰਤ ਵਾਲੇ ਜਾਂ ਪੰਜਾਬ ਵਾਲੇ ਸਮਝਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਤਾਂ ਸਾਡੀ ਕੋਈ ਖਾਸ ਕਿਸਮ ਦੀ ਭਾਵੁਕਤਾ ਨਾਲ ਜੁੜੀ ਹੁੰਦੀ ਆ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਕੋਲ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੁੰਦੀ ਤੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਪਰਸਪੈਕਟਿਵ ਵੱਖਰੀ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਦਾ ਹੋ ਜਾਂਦਾ। ਤਾਂ ਪਾਰਟੀਸ਼ਨ ਨੂੰ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਸਾਡੇ ਕੋਲ ਇੱਕ ਵੱਖਰੀ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਦਾ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਪਰਸਪੈਕਟਿਵ ਆ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਹਵਾਲੇ ਨਾਲ ਸਾਹਮਣੇ ਆਉਂਦਾ। ਪਰ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਗੱਲ ਮੈਂ ਜ਼ੋਰ ਦੇ ਕੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਲੈਕਚਰ ਦੇ ਹਵਾਲੇ ਨਾਲ ਕਹਿਣਾ ਚਾਹੁੰਦਾ ਕਿ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਓਰਲ ਨੈਰੇਟਿਵਸ ਨੇ ਪਿਛਲੇ ਸਮੇਂ ਦੌਰਾਨ ਬਹੁਤ ਜ਼ਿਆਦਾ ਸਾਡੇ ਸਾਹਮਣੇ ਆ ਰਹੇ ਨੇ। ਤਾਂ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਕਿਹਾ ਕਿ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਇਹ ਨੌਲੇਜ ਆ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਓਰਲ ਨੈਰੇਟਿਵਸ ਰਾਹੀਂ ਆ ਰਹੀ ਆ ਜਾਂ ਪਾਰਟੀਸ਼ਨ ਮਿਊਜ਼ੀਅਮਸ ਰਾਹੀਂ ਆ ਰਹੀ ਆ ਉਹਦੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਕਮੋਡੀਫਿਕੇਸ਼ਨ ਹੋ ਰਹੀ ਆ ਉਹਦੀ ਇੰਡਸਟਰੀ ਬਣ ਰਹੀ ਆ ਕਿ ਅਸੀਂ ਉਸ ਕੁਐਸਚਨ ਨੂੰ ਕਿਵੇਂ ਡੀਲ ਕਰ ਸਕਦੇ ਹਾਂ। ਹਲੇ ਤੱਕ ਅਸੀਂ ਇਸ ਕੁਐਸਚਨ ਨੂੰ ਡੀਲ ਹੀ ਨਹੀਂ ਕੀਤਾ ਤੇ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਬਹੁਤ ਖੁਸ਼ੀ ਹੋਈ ਕਿ ਪ੍ਰੋਫੈਸਰ ਟੈਲਬਟ ਨੇ ਕੁਐਸਚਨ ਉਠਾਇਆ ਮੋਡੀਫਿਕੇਸ਼ਨ ਆਫ ਨੌਲੇਜ ਦਾ, ਜਿਹੜੀ ਪਾਰਟੀਸ਼ਨ ਇੰਡਸਟਰੀ ਬਣ ਰਹੀ ਆ। ਸਾਨੂੰ ਇਸ ਨੂੰ ਸੰਬੋਧਿਤ ਹੋਣਾ ਪਊਗਾ ਕਿ ਇਸ ਨੂੰ ਕਿਵੇਂ ਡੀਲ ਕਰਨਾ। ਇਸੇ ਤਰੀਕੇ ਨਾਲ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਮਿਊਜ਼ੀਅਮ ਬਣ ਰਹੇ ਨੇ ਉਹ ਵੀ ਇੱਕ ਬਹੁਤ ਇੰਪੋਰਟੈਂਟ ਇਸ਼ੂ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਉਹਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਕਿਵੇਂ ਡੀਲ ਕੀਤਾ ਜਾ ਸਕਦਾ। ਇੱਕ ਹੋਰ ਗੱਲ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਬਹੁਤ ਇੰਟਰਸਟਿੰਗ ਸਾਹਮਣੇ ਆਈ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਡਾਇਸਪੋਰਾ ਦੇ ਕੋਲ ਹੁਣ ਪਾਰਟੀਸ਼ਨ ਦੀ ਬਹੁਤ ਸਾਰੀ ਸਕਾਲਰਸ਼ਿਪ ਚਲੇ ਗਈ ਆ, ਤਾਂ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਨਜ਼ਰ ਤੇ ਵੀ ਧਿਆਨ ਰੱਖਣੀ ਪਊਗੀ ਕਿ ਉਹ ਇਸ ਪਾਰਟੀਸ਼ਨ ਦੇ ਸਾਰੇ ਹੋਲ ਐਪੀਸੋਡ ਨੂੰ ਕਿਵੇਂ ਦੇਖ ਰਹੇ ਨੇ, ਕਿ ਉਹ ਕੀ ਕਰ ਰਹੇ ਨੇ, ਕਿਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਦੀ ਖੋਜ ਨਾਲ ਦੀ ਨਾਲ, ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਬਹੁਤੀ ਖੋਜ ਹੁਣ ਅੰਗਰੇਜ਼ੀ 'ਚ ਪਾਰਟੀਸ਼ਨ ਤੇ ਹੋ ਰਹੀ ਹੈ ਤੇ ਮੁੱਖ ਸੁਰ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਉਹੀ ਆ ਰਹੀ ਹੈ, ਪਰ ਪੰਜਾਬ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਵੀ ਜਿਹੜੀਆਂ ਲੋਕਲ ਲੈਂਗੁਏਜਿਸ ਨੇ, ਚਾਹੇ ਉਹ ਸ਼ਾਹਮੁਖੀ ਹੋਵੇ ਚਾਹੇ ਸਾਡੀ ਗੁਰਮੁਖੀ ਹੋਵੇ, ਉਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਵੀ ਬਹੁਤ ਸਾਰਾ ਕੰਮ ਸਾਹਮਣੇ ਆ ਰਿਹਾ ਤੇ ਉਹ ਕੰਮ ਕਈ ਵਾਰ ਭਾਸ਼ਾ ਦੀ ਸੀਮਾ ਕਰਕੇ ਜਾਂ ਕਈ ਹੋਰ ਕਾਰਨਾਂ ਕਰਕੇ ਸਾਰਿਆਂ ਦੇ ਸਾਹਮਣੇ ਨਹੀਂ ਆ ਪਾਉਂਦਾ। ਪਰ ਮੈਂ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਇਹ ਦੱਸਣਾ ਚਾਹੁੰਦਾ ਕਿ ਸਾਡੇ ਪੰਜਾਬੀ ਸਟੱਡੀਜ਼ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਵੀ ਪਾਰਟੀਸ਼ਨ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਜੁੜਿਆ ਹੋਇਆ ਕਾਫੀ ਸਾਰਾ ਕੰਮ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਉਹ ਸਾਹਮਣੇ ਆ ਰਿਹਾ, ਤੇ ਉਹਦੇ ਬਾਰੇ ਵੀ ਅਸੀਂ ਜ਼ਰੂਰ ਇਸ ਲੈਕਚਰ ਸੀਰੀਜ਼ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਪੰਜਾਬੀ ਦੇ ਕੁਝ ਲੈਕਚਰ ਕਰਵਾਵਾਂਗੇ ਜਿਹਨਾਂ ਨਾਲ ਉਹ ਇਸ਼ੂ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਉਹ ਸਾਹਮਣੇ ਆ ਸਕੇ। ਪ੍ਰੋਫੈਸਰ ਟਾਲਬਟ ਹੋਰਾਂ ਦਾ ਇੱਕ ਉਹ ਪਹਿਲੂ ਕਿ ਜਿਹੜਾ এনवायरमेंट ਤੇ ਅਸਰ ਹੋਇਆ, এনवायरमेंटल ਡਾਇਮੈਂਸ਼ਨ ਆ ਪਾਰਟੀਸ਼ਨ ਦੀ, ਉਹ ਵੀ ਬਹੁਤ ਇੰਪੋਰਟੈਂਟ ਆ, ਜਿਹਦੇ ਬਾਰੇ ਅਸੀਂ ਬਹੁਤੀ ਖੋਜ ਹਲੇ ਨਹੀਂ ਕਰ ਸਕੇ, ਬਲਕਿ ਬਹੁਤਾ ਸੋਚਿਆ ਹੀ ਨਹੀਂ ਜਾ ਸਕਿਆ। ਸੋ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਇੱਕ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਨਾਲ ਨਾ ਕੇਵਲ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਕੰਮ ਹੋਇਆ ਉਹਦੀ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਪੂਰਾ ਇੱਕ ਕ੍ਰਮ ਦੱਸਿਆ, ਸਗੋਂ ਨਾਲ ਦੀ ਨਾਲ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਹੁਣ ਇਸ਼ੂਜ਼ ਪਾਰਟੀਸ਼ਨ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਸੰਬੰਧਿਤ ਇੰਪੋਰਟੈਂਟ ਹੋ ਰਹੇ ਨੇ ਕਿ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਅਸੀਂ ਨਵੀਂ ਡਾਇਮੈਂਸ਼ਨਸ ਤੋਂ ਸਟੱਡੀ ਕਰਨੀ ਆ, ਉਹ ਕਿਹੜੀਆਂ ਡਾਇਮੈਂਸ਼ਨਸ ਹੋ ਸਕਦੀਆਂ ਨੇ, ਉਸ ਦੇ ਮਾਮਲੇ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਬਹੁਤ ਖੂਬਸੂਰਤ ਗੱਲਾਂ ਕੀਤੀਆਂ ਨੇ। ਜਿਹੜਾ ਪ੍ਰੋਫੈਸਰ ਅਰਵਿੰਦ ਹੋਰਾਂ ਨੇ ਸਵਾਲ ਉਠਾਇਆ ਕਿ ਸਿੱਖਾਂ ਨੇ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਕਦੇ ਇਉਂ ਨਹੀਂ ਕੀਤਾ, ਪਾਰਟੀਸ਼ਨ ਵੇਲੇ ਪਹਿਲੀ ਵਾਰ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਐਥੀਕਲ ਡਾਇਮੈਂਸ਼ਨ ਸੀ ਸਿੱਖ ਹੋਣ ਦੀ, ਉਹਨੂੰ ਤਲਾਂਜਲੀ ਦਿੱਤੀ, ਤੇ ਉਹ ਵੀ ਇੱਕ ਗੱਲ ਨਾ ਸਮਝੀ, ਹਾਲੇ ਤੱਕ ਸਮਝੀ ਨਹੀਂ ਗਈ ਸਾਡੇ ਕੋਲ। ਸੋ ਪਾਰਟੀਸ਼ਨ ਨਾਲ 75 ਸਾਲ 74 ਸਾਲ ਬੀਤਣ ਤੋਂ ਬਾਅਦ ਵੀ ਇੰਨੇ ਸਾਰੇ ਪਹਿਲੂ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਨੇ, ਜਿਹੜੇ ਐਕਸਪਲੋਰ ਕਰਨ ਵਾਲੇ ਪਏ ਨੇ, ਜਿਹੜੇ ਇਸ਼ੂਜ਼ ਤੇ ਅਸੀਂ ਕੰਮ ਕਰਦੇ ਰਹਾਂਗੇ, ਕੰਮ ਕਰਨਾ ਚਾਹੀਦਾ। ਤੇ ਉਸੇ ਤਰਜ਼ ਤੇ ਉਸੇ ਤੌਰ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਇਹ ਲੈਕਚਰ ਹੋਇਆ, ਇਸ ਗੱਲ ਦੀ ਬਹੁਤ ਖੁਸ਼ੀ ਆ, ਤੇ ਅਗਲੇ ਲੈਕਚਰਾਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਇਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਦੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਐਨਰਿਚਿੰਗ ਸਕਾਲਰਸ਼ਿਪ ਸਾਡੇ ਸਾਹਮਣੇ ਆਊਗੀ। ਤੇ ਹੁਣ ਫਿਰ ਮੈਂ ਫਾਰਮਲ ਵੋਟ ਆਫ ਥੈਂਕਸ ਵੱਲ ਆਉਣਾ ਤੇ ਉਹ ਅੰਗਰੇਜ਼ੀ 'ਚ ਹੋਊਗਾ। ਤੇ ਸਭ ਤੋਂ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ first of all, I thank Professor Ian Talbot for such an enriching and engaging talk and for highlighting the directions in which research on partition in the 21st century needs to move. I thank Professor Arvind for his time and unconditional support and other creative inputs. I also thank Professor Eleanor for sparing her time. I thank Professor Anjali Giroy for coming up with the idea of partition lecture series. I hope this collaboration between our center and School of Humanities and Social Sciences, IIT Khadagpur, would go a long way in building academic and institutional partnership. I also thank Ritika and Ashwarya for their back-end support. I also thank Sukhdeep ji and Manpreet ji for technical support. I would thank everyone who joined us via YouTube and Facebook live broadcast. Thank you so much. Okay, ji, now we will leave. We can leave the.
Thank you so much, everyone, for sparing your precious time.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everyone.
नहीं आ सकते अभी।
Live telecast रोक दो जी।
Thank you so much for letting me come right at the end.
Yes.
Apologies for little bursts of Punjabi that you might have heard in the background.
No.